have to have, in just assuming that violence sells, however, we have to have a higher standard than what sells. I think that's the bottom line. Unless any of you have wishes to the contrary, I'm going to call on you in the order of your appearance here. Senator Conrad, you were the first here, and we'll call on our colleague from North Dakota, Senator Conrad.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you very much for holding this hearing, because I think it's an important one. Most of all, I want to thank you for the leadership that you've provided on this issue. I must say that I personally was moved to act after listening to you in Virginia at the Democratic Senators' retreat there just a few weeks ago. Because after my own family has experienced violence here in this city, listening to your explanation of the effect of television violence moved me to act to try to reduce the level of violence in our society. Mr. Chairman, you have provided the industry with a window of opportunity to act to reduce the level of violence on television in the movies, and to do so voluntarily. Mr. Chairman, you have given this industry an opportunity they ought to take. Because if my constituency is any measure, if they fail to act, someone is going to act for them. Mr. Chairman, this issue is important to the country. There is simply too much violence. And violence in the media is contributing to violence in our society. The examples abound. From the 13-year-old in California who murdered a friend's father and then poured salt in his wounds because he said he'd seen it on TV, to the 26 young men and boys who killed themselves playing Russian roulette after watching a movie on television that showed the same thing, to example after example, we know there is a connection. We don't need any more scientific studies. Common sense tells us that the repetition of violence on television and in the movies is having an impact on the young people and even the not so young in our society. Mr. Chairman, at the very time the FBI is telling us that juvenile violent crime is soaring, we are also seeing an epidemic of television violence. American Psychological Association tells us by the time a child is 12 years old, they will have witnessed 100,000 acts of violence on television, including 8,000 murders. Mr. Chairman, you referenced Tom Shales indicating that May was Murder Month. I brought along a chart that shows the advertisements from TV Week, just for 1 week. The cover, tale of a Nebraska killing spree. Inside, Black Widow murders, murder in the heartland, visions of murder, 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 murder. How can it not have an effect? And Mr. Chairman, you were also quite right to point out that life imitates art, because next to the ads from TV Week, we have the story of what happened in Manitoba. A young man, 17 years old, 18 years old, kills his 13-year-old girlfriend's mother and her brother days after watching Murder in the Heartland. The story of Charles Starkweather, who at age 17 killed his 14-year-old girlfriend's mother and her stepfather and her sister. Now, Mr. Chairman, enough is enough. The tape that you showed, I think, demonstrated better than anything we can say how things have gone too far. Enough is enough. Mr. Chairman, after listening to you in Virginia, I went home to North Dakota and called together educators, law enforcement, people who advocate for children, church leaders, and we decided to start a petition drive to influence the executives who are meeting in August. And after I saw the outpouring of interest in my state, I came back to Washington and called a national group together, again including law enforcement, educators, church leaders, advocates for children, and we have agreed to start a national coalition. And we'll be announcing a drive the first week of June, and I very much hope everyone here will be involved. Let me just close by saying, Mr. Chairman, you are the one who has led this fight. You are the one who has put the focus on the issue. You couldn't have been more right to do so, and I just want to personally thank you for what you've done, because I think it's going to make a difference. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Senator Conrad. Congressman Markey has been a leader, and let me also pay tribute to Congressman Dan Glickman for his leadership also in the House. Congressman Markey held a hearing last week on this subject. Congressman Markey.
Thank you, Senator, very much, and I want to echo what the other members have said about you and your leadership on this issue. Without question, the 1990 Act has helped to elevate dramatically the attention nationally on this issue. The other members have as well helped. You mentioned Congressman Glickman. He worked with you on that 1990 Act. Tremendously important change in terms of how this issue has been viewed since the passage of that act. The problem that we have right now is that we're in the middle of a sweeps month, and all of the networks are driven, unfortunately, by the need for them to convince advertisers that they can get the highest possible ratings, because the advertising rate which they're allowed to charge over the next several months will be based upon their ratings. And unfortunately, networks know that violence sells, and advertisers want to be attached to the highest rated programs. What they're beginning to learn, though, is that anti-violence also sells to the Congress and to the American public. And this drama is about to unfold in our country as we begin to have this debate. For many years, much like the debate over the linkage between cigarettes and cancer, there has been some uncertainty in some minds as to whether or not there is, in fact, a linkage between violence on television and then subsequent violent behavior in individuals, much the same way we debated that cancer cigarette linkage. Now I think there's no question. Behavioral scientists, you have Professor Centerwall here today. He testified on the House side 2 weeks ago. Across the board, they all agree. It's not just a relationship. It is actually a causal link between the program which is seen and then subsequent violent behavior. And let's be honest, why would advertisers want to have their products identified with a program to be shown unless they thought the viewers would then act on what they saw as an ad, to go out and buy the product? That is the essence of what advertising is. So we have now the primetime crime wave to bring in the highest ratings. We've seen no real reduction thus far. We hear promises of previews of coming attractions for the future, but we see no real compelling evidence that there has been a change thus far. The fact of the matter is television is on an average of 6.5 hours in every home in the United States every single day. With the exception of the family and the school, it is the third major influence on the development of the personality of every person in our country. 6.5 hours every single day, every single home on average. So let us not deny then that there is a huge problem on our hands. The mystery is no longer whether or not violence affects children. The mystery is why the networks, the advertisers, the programmers haven't done anything to change their attitudes towards the amount of violence which they put on the air. And as an electronic teacher, what we see across the board is in family after family, attitudes being developed by those who are unduly exposed to this violent behavior. So our job then is to find some way of dealing with the issue. What I recommend is a two-step proposal. One, that we have a voluntary rating system similar to the rating system which has been used by the Motion Picture Association over the last 25 years, so that families can inform themselves as to the violent content of programming. Now, I would clearly want this to be done on a voluntary basis, so that there is a V, some symbol that the parents can rely upon to know that, in fact, there is a violent content in a program. And then it's up to the parents to decide, or the family to decide, how they want their families to interact with that programming. I don't think that's censorship. I don't think that that's a violation of any producer or writer or director or broadcaster's First Amendment rights, that the consumer of the product knows what's inside. We do that for movies right now. The precedent has set. We're not reinventing the wheel. And secondly, that all new television sets in the United States must include a technology with the capability of blocking out particular channels or programs. Parents cannot consistently, on a day-by-day basis, monitor every single program which is on the air. That is completely unrealistic. But if parents knew in advance which programs are going to be on, by using their TV Week guide with the V's, it could be programmed in advance, a television set, to block out all of the V programs on that set for the week or the month, in the discretion of the parents. Their constitutional rights to not allow this information into their home. Now, this is something which is doable. This can be put together as a V block that blocks out violence, that the parents, by remote control, can just eradicate from the programming which is coming into their home. And if the producers, directors, Hollywood, broadcasters agree on a voluntary basis, then it will be ratings ready. You'll have the ratings that will be there, and when the technology is out there in the marketplace within the next year or so, they can begin to zap it out. Now, why is that important? It's important because the advertisers are clearly looking for a certain type of consumer. In many ways, the bottom one-third of the socioeconomic spectrum just happens to be the beneficiary of the programming which is on television, but advertisers are not targeting them. The most desirable consumers, that upper one-third, are the ones most likely to be purchasing new television sets over the next year or two or three in this country. And if 10 or 15% of them start blocking out with the V block all the violence that's on their programs, advertisers will pay attention. Broadcasters will pay attention. Those are the people who they are, in fact, targeting. Now, you ask, how is this possible? Well, in 1990, we passed through Congress, out of my committee and a counterpart committee over here on the Senate side, a television decoder act, which required that every new television set in America be closed caption ready, so that the 24 million Americans who are deaf or hard of hearing would have a closed caption capacity built into their television set, mandated by the federal government. That law has now come to pass, and in fact, every television set being manufactured has this capability, so that closed captioning is in every television set on the market in our country today for the 24 million Americans. Well, interestingly, this is something done by the electronics industry of America as part of their standard setting requirements. Now, in my conversations with them over the last month, it turns out that they can do the same thing to make television sets by remote control ready for a violence block as well, just part of their computer programming inside of the set. A relatively simple thing for them to do, in fact. But interestingly, there's a debate that rages inside of the electronics industry of America, and the NAB is part of it, that requires a consensus to have been reached on the subject of whether or not this computer capacity should be built into TV sets. My feeling is that as a continuation of the Dakota Act of 1990, that they should be made ready, and that we should put the pressure on the industry to ensure that every television set has that capacity. That combination balances the rights of the Hollywood producing, writing, broadcasting community to put on any program they want. Let them put it on. And the rights established by this committee in the Bork hearings, the rights of the privacy of each individual to block it out of their home if they don't want it in their home. Each side with their rights, each able to exercise them fully. And either side then can react to the exercise of the other's rights. And my own feeling is that the broadcasters and the advertisers in their own interest will begin to look at the program Cheers and wonder why so many people were watching it last night, and try to find people who can write programs that attract those kind of audiences that have parents cheering across the country. I congratulate you and thank you, Senator, for this opportunity to be here.
We thank you, Congressman Markey. Senator Dorgan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I began to look at this issue in January of this year, and when I did, came across the body of work that you have done and echo my colleagues in complimenting you. I know that Senator Conrad has held a hearing on this subject. Congressman Markey has been involved. Senator Dernberger has introduced legislation in the Senate. The evaluation that I did of television violence over the recent months resulted in my introduction this week of legislation on the issue, and I would approach it a somewhat different way, although I think that the suggestions by my colleagues today have great merit. Senator Conrad discusses grassroots pressure, which I think is very important. Congressman Markey talks about a technology approach to this, which I also think we ought to seriously look at. I introduced legislation that would require the Federal Communications Commission to offer each quarter a television violence report card in which they would not make judgments about the quality of the programming. They would simply make a compilation of the violent acts on programming, release that compilation by program and by sponsor. I don't suggest we solve this from the top down. I suggest we solve it from the bottom up so that parents understand where is this violence and who's sponsoring it. And that way they can better supervise children's viewing habits. It's interesting, I had a pediatrician come to my office a while back, and I asked him, we were talking about health care. I said, how have things changed in health care? He said, well, the children come with different injuries these days. I said, really, how's that? Oh, he said, a little boy comes, been hit over the side of the head with a baseball bat, full force. Why is that, I asked? Well, he said, you know, a child 4 years old watches Ninja Turtles, and at 4 doesn't determine the difference between reality and fantasy. Goes outside, grabs a baseball bat, and hits the neighbor kid over the head with a baseball bat. Clearly, children imitate. No one in this room could seriously believe that children don't imitate. Why on earth would advertisers invest the money they invest in programming if they didn't believe people imitate? Children pick up, especially children, pick up their cues from television about how to solve their problems, how to look cool. That's why advertisers do what they do, but it's also why children especially react the way they react to this increasing violence on television. We have in this country a situation where kids, when they graduate from high school, have sat in the classroom about 12,500 hours and have sat in front of a television set somewhere close to 20,000 hours. Children are clearly, when they graduate from high school, more a product of what they've seen than what they've read. And what they've seen increasingly, especially during the past decade, is a tripling of violence on American television. In my judgment, it's unhealthy. Should we censor it? Should we regulate it? I don't suggest that in this appearance. I don't think that we ought to develop thought police. But should we provide more information by which people can supervise the viewing habits of children? Should we provide more pressure on the industry to act more responsibly? Certainly, I think we should do that. This hearing moves in that direction. This hearing begins to solve part of this problem. This hearing airs publicly what most parents in this country think and talk about privately. And that's the value of this sort of a step. When I introduced my legislation this week, I said this on the floor of the Senate. I said, imagine the following scene in your house. A large truck drives up to your house, and a man dressed in a fancy suit jumps out of the truck and knocks on your door. He's come to make a proposition to you. He says in his truck, he's got a big troupe of actors, wonderful, creative actors, and he's got a lot of dazzling props. He proposes to take them into your family room and put on a show for you and your children. He says the actors will shoot and stab and bludgeon each other. They'll even do simulated fire bombings of cars and buildings. They'll enact about 32 such acts each hour, about 32 acts an hour, all evening long, as long as your children are awake. And they'll come back and repeat those enactments tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. They'll spend more time with your children than you do. They'll teach them to solve problems and settle their differences by killing, by conflict. They'll convey to them that the adult world really approves of this kind of behavior, that it's glamorous and attractive, and it's sort of the coolest way to deal with problems, that violence works. Is there one parent in this country that would accept that proposition from the man that knocked on the door, to come to your living room with that troupe of actors, to demonstrate that to your children? Of course not. They'd probably report the man in the expensive suit to the authorities for child abuse. Yet precisely this transaction occurs every day in this country, in virtually every home. It happens to the television set, and that man in the expensive suit slips past the parents, right through the television set, right to the kids. And those who do this are insulated from the consequences of their own behavior, because there's not a lot of discussion in this country about who's doing this, who's responsible for it, and why are they doing it. And it's very, very difficult for the parents to guard the door, because the door is in the television set. And I just appear today to say to you, I don't think there's any question anymore. When they say television imitates life, yes, it does. And life imitates television. Of course it does. There's no question anymore that the increasing violence on television is unhealthy for this country, and especially its children. And we need to find ways to give people the tools, give people the additional information necessary with which to better send messages to those who